It is just past dawn in one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Earth, and 2 tankers are on fire. Smoke curls off the decks of the Mombasa and the Al Bahia as crew members scramble for lifeboats, radios crackle with distress calls, and somewhere in Abu Dhabi, a phone rings in the middle of the night with news no defense ministry ever wants to deliver. 1 sailor is dead. 8 more are wounded, 4 of them critically. A waterway that carries roughly a third of the world's seaborne oil has just become, once again, a battlefield. And the question rippling from the bridge of a burning tanker all the way to the trading floors of New York, to the war rooms of the Pentagon, and the foreign ministry briefings in Beijing is the same one that has haunted this region for months. Is this the moment the fragile peace finally breaks for good, or is it simply the latest scene in a war that never really ended? To understand how the world arrived at this exact combustible moment, you have to rewind the clock, because what happened in the southern lane of the Strait of Hormuz this week did not come out of nowhere. It is the latest tremor in a fault line that cracked open back in late February when the United States and Israel launched one of the most audacious military operations of the 21st century, an operation with a name that sounds almost too cinematic to be real. Operation Epic Fury. In the span of roughly 12 hours, American and Israeli forces carried out nearly 900 strikes across Iran, hitting missile sites, air defenses, military command centers, and, in an opening blow that reshaped the entire conflict, the residence of Iran's supreme leader himself. Ali Khamenei, who had ruled Iran since 1989, was killed in the very first wave, along with senior commanders of the Revolutionary Guard and members of his own family. It was a decapitation strike in the truest sense, and for a few stunned hours the world wondered whether the Islamic Republic itself might simply cease to exist. But regimes rarely fall as cleanly as their adversaries hope. Khamenei's son was quickly installed as his successor, and rather than collapsing, Iran's military apparatus did something its planners had spent years preparing for. It scattered, decentralized, and struck back. Missiles and drones poured out of Iranian territory toward Israel, toward American bases across the Gulf, toward Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Within days, Iran's Shiite ally in Lebanon, Hezbollah, joined the fight, dragging northern Israel into a second front. Gulf states that had spent the last decade quietly building economic ties with Tehran now found themselves targeted by the very missiles they had hoped to avoid. And some of them, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, began striking back in turn. What had been framed by Washington and Jerusalem as a surgical operation to eliminate a nuclear threat had, within 72 hours, become a full-blown regional war. And to understand why this administration believed a strike of this scale was necessary in the first place, you have to go back further still, to a decision made years earlier in Washington. In 2018, during his first term, President Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear agreement negotiated under his predecessor, reimposing crushing sanctions on Iran under a strategy his administration called maximum pressure. Successive administrations kept much of that pressure in place, and when Trump returned to office, he doubled down on it. By September of 2025, the United Nations had reimposed its own sanctions through what diplomats call the snapback mechanism, a legal trigger buried in the original nuclear deal that allowed member states to restore punishing restrictions on Iran's economy virtually overnight. Iran's currency cratered. The price of meat, rice, and basic staples soared. Protests broke out in cities across the country, protests that Iranian security forces met, as they so often had before, with brutal crackdowns. It was, by every account, a regime approaching one of the weakest points in its history. And that weakness became, in the eyes of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his American counterpart, an opportunity. Iran, they argued, was accelerating a covert push toward a nuclear weapon even as its economy buckled. And if the country was ever going to be stopped, this fragile moment was the one to do it. Iran, for its part, has always denied seeking a bomb, insisting its nuclear program exists to generate civilian power, not weapons. It is a denial with a long and complicated history behind it. Iran's pursuit of nuclear technology stretches back to the late 1950s, decades before any of the leaders now fighting this war were even in power, and it took on a far more urgent character during the brutal war Iran fought with Iraq in the 1980s, when Tehran's leadership concluded that its own security could never again depend on the goodwill of its neighbors or the great powers. Through the 1990s, Iran quietly built partnerships with Russia and China to advance that research. By 2002, an exiled opposition group revealed the existence of 2 previously hidden nuclear sites, a disclosure that set off 2 decades of inspections, negotiations, sanctions, and diplomatic breakthroughs and reversals that most of the world stopped closely following long before this war ever began. The nuclear deal reached in the middle of the last decade was supposed to be the resolution to all of it, a framework in which Iran accepted strict limits and monitoring in exchange for relief from sanctions that had strangled its economy for years. Whether that deal was working as intended when the United States walked away from it in 2018 remains one of the most fiercely contested questions in the arguments over how and whether this entire war could have been avoided. Trump's team argued the agreement was too permissive, too temporary, too easily circumvented. Critics, including many of Washington's own European allies, argued that walking away removed the very inspections regime that had been keeping Iran's program in check, and that everything which followed, the renewed enrichment, the renewed sanctions, the renewed crisis, flowed directly from that original decision. That denial did little to slow the momentum toward war, and once the strikes began, momentum became its own kind of engine. Within the first days of Operation Epic Fury, roughly 170 people were killed when a missile struck a girls' school near a naval base in the Iranian city of Minab, an early tragedy that both sides would spend months arguing over, the United States insisting it does not target civilians, independent investigators still, working to establish exactly what happened. Israel evacuated more than 1 million people from southern Lebanon as its ground forces pushed into territory held by Hezbollah. A United States submarine sank an Iranian frigate off the coast of Sri Lanka, killing dozens of sailors who had only days earlier been participating in an international naval review in India. An Israeli stealth fighter shot down a crewed Iranian jet in what analysts called a historic first for aerial combat. And through it all, the economic shockwaves kept building, oil markets convulsing, shipping companies rerouting entire fleets away from the Gulf, insurance premiums for tankers spiking to levels not seen in a generation. By the second week of March, Iran had done what analysts long feared it eventually would. It moved to choke the Strait of Hormuz itself, the narrow channel through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas has historically flowed in peacetime. A choke point so vital to the global economy that simply threatening to close it has, for decades, been enough to send markets into a spiral. This time, it wasn't just a threat. Ships began coming under direct attack. Insurers pulled back. Energy analysts started drawing worried comparisons to the oil shocks of the 1970s, and for ordinary people thousands of miles from the Gulf, the war in Iran stopped being a distant headline and became something felt directly at the gas pump, in grocery store prices, in every corner of an economy that runs, in ways most people never think about, on the uninterrupted flow of tankers through that one narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. After 40 grinding days of combat, exhaustion finally did what diplomacy alone could not. On April 8th, a ceasefire took hold, a fragile pause bought not by trust, but by sheer depletion on every side. It did not last in any simple sense. Israel kept striking Hezbollah targets in Lebanon even after the guns nominally fell silent, and Iran refused, again and again, to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, treating the waterway less as international property and more as leverage it could dole out or withhold depending on how negotiations were going. Talks in Islamabad in mid-April, mediated in part by Pakistan, collapsed within 2 days, and Washington responded by imposing a naval blockade of its own, an extraordinary escalation that effectively meant 2 rival blockades, American and Iranian, choking the same strait from opposite directions at the same time. It took until mid-June for the two sides to finally produce something resembling an actual end to the war. A memorandum negotiated once again under Pakistani mediation, and on June 17th, in a moment almost startling in its symbolism, Trump traveled to the Palace of Versailles, the very seat of European monarchy and the site where world wars have historically been settled on paper, to sign the agreement. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian signed his own copy in Tehran the same day. The dual blockades lifted less than 24 hours later. For a moment, in the language diplomats use when they are being cautiously hopeful, there was daylight. There was room to imagine that the deadliest Middle Eastern war in a generation might actually be over. But peace, in this part of the world, has always been measured less in signed documents than in what happens after the ink dries. And what happened after the ink dried was this. Iran, despite the memorandum, continued to assert what amounted to a claim of ownership over the Strait of Hormuz, repeatedly warning commercial vessels that they needed to use pre-approved routes and follow protocols set not by international maritime law, but by Tehran itself. It was a quiet, grinding campaign to convert a shared global waterway into something resembling a toll road, and Iran backed its warnings with force, firing on multiple commercial vessels, including 3 separate ships in the span of just 2 days in early July. Each strike tested the outer edges of the memorandum a little further. Each American response pushed back a little harder. And then, in the early hours of July 12th, Iran did what it had been threatening for weeks. It announced the indefinite closure of the Strait of Hormuz entirely, citing what it called unsafe conditions caused by illegal foreign interference. a phrase that, translated out of diplomatic language, essentially meant that Iran considered the American and Allied military presence in the Gulf itself to be the provocation. The response from Washington was immediate. Central Command confirmed a new wave of offensive strikes against Iran. 1970s oil shocks, a comparison that carries real weight, given that, according to International Energy Agency figures, roughly 34% of the entire planet's oil supply passed through the Strait of Hormuz in 2025 alone. When that pipeline shutters, the tremor is not confined to the Gulf. It reaches gas stations, shipping insurers, airlines, and grocery bills on every continent within days. And then, into this combustible mix, President Trump added a twist that managed to be both a show of American resolve and, to allies and rivals alike, something genuinely unprecedented. He announced not merely that the United States would resume its naval blockade of Iranian shipping, but that America would now formally position itself as what he called, in his own words on social media, the guardian of the Hormuz Strait, promising that all other nations would retain fair and open use of the waterway, while imposing what amounted to a 20% toll on cargo shipped through it, framed as reimbursement for the cost of providing security in one of the most volatile stretches of ocean on the planet. It was a stunning proposition, converting a strategic military posture into something resembling a commercial enterprise, and it did not go unchallenged. The International Maritime Organization, the United Nations' own shipping authority, pushed back almost immediately, stating plainly that it stands firmly against charging fees for passage through straits used for international navigation, and that no legal basis exists for imposing mandatory tolls simply to transit through one. Whether that toll ever becomes reality, whether it survives contact with international law, with allied objections, with the sheer logistics of collecting money from thousands of vessels a year, remains one of the open questions hanging over this entire crisis. It was against this backdrop, oil markets lurching, sirens sounding from Amman to Manama, tankers still smoldering in the strait, that the world's attention snapped briefly toward Beijing, where headlines began circulating with a jolt of their own, framing China as poised for a dramatic entry into the war itself. It is worth pausing here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where the line between what is confirmed and what is sensationalized matters most. What China's foreign ministry actually said, through spokesperson Lin Yan at a routine briefing in Beijing, was considerably more measured than some of the framing around it suggested. Responding to Iran's announcement of the strait's closure, Lin stated that the Strait of Hormuz is a channel for international navigation, that restoring safe and free passage serves the interests of all parties, and that Beijing stands ready to maintain communication with relevant countries and the international community on the issue. It was, in substance, a diplomatic call for stability rather than a declaration of military intent, consistent with statements China's government had already made earlier. In July, urging unimpeded passage through the strait, as European powers quietly signaled they might accept paying transit fees to Iran and Oman just to keep their own tankers moving. That distinction matters enormously, because China's actual interest in this conflict is real, but it is economic before it is martial. China imports a staggering share of its oil from the Gulf, and a closed or contested Strait of Hormuz threatens Beijing's energy security every bit as much as it threatens Washington's global standing. So, when Chinese officials say they are ready to engage diplomatically, ready to talk, ready to push for a resolution that keeps the tankers moving, that readiness is genuine and it is significant. It signals that Beijing sees itself as a stakeholder with leverage to spend quietly in back channels with Tehran, with Gulf capitals, potentially even indirectly with Washington. But readiness to engage diplomatically and readiness to enter a shooting war are two entirely different postures, and conflating them, however, tempting the headline, risks manufacturing a crisis within a crisis. What is confirmed is a call for calm and open communication. What remains speculation, for now, is anything resembling a Chinese military commitment. As with so much else in this conflict, the responsible path is to watch closely, verify carefully, and resist the pull of the most dramatic possible interpretation of an ambiguous diplomatic statement, an effort to degrade Tehran's ability to keep menacing international shipping. Iran answered in kind, its Revolutionary Guard claiming it had destroyed American long-range radar and maritime surveillance systems in Oman and struck U.S. military facilities in Bahrain. And it was in this exact window, this narrow, superheated stretch of hours, that the Strait of Hormuz produced the images that would dominate news coverage across the globe. Two Emirati oil tankers, the Mombasa and the Al-Bahia, hit by Iranian cruise missiles while transiting the southern lane of the strait, inside Omani territorial waters, technically outside the direct battle space of Iran, and yet caught squarely inside it anyway. The UAE Defense Ministry did not mince words in its response, condemning the attack as a blatant breach of international law and declaring that the Emirates retained the full right to respond and take whatever measures it deemed necessary to protect its sovereignty. Of the 8 sailors wounded, 6 were Indian nationals, 2 were Ukrainian, underscoring something easy to forget in the fog of great power conflict, which is that the human cost of a war between nations almost always falls hardest on people who have nothing to do with the politics driving it. Sailors from countries thousands of miles away simply trying to move cargo through a strait that happens to sit between 2 governments, locked in a fight neither of them will call off. Iran, notably, framed its own actions differently, with its military claiming through state media that it had struck and disabled 2 so-called rogue supertankers, hours before the UAE's own casualty figures emerged, a semantic gap that captures something essential about this entire conflict. Almost nothing that happens in the Gulf right now arrives to the outside world as a single, agreed-upon fact. It arrives as competing claims, filtered through state broadcasters, defense ministries, and social media statements, each side describing the same missile strike in language calibrated for its own audience. It is the job of honest reporting, and it should be the instinct of anyone trying to understand this war, to hold those competing versions apart, to note clearly what is confirmed by multiple independent sources, what remains a claim from just one side, and what is still simply unknown. Elsewhere across the region that same night, the pattern of the war reasserted itself in ways that felt almost rehearsed by now. Jordan's air defense systems intercepted and destroyed 4 missiles fired from Iranian territory. Bahrain's missile alert sirens sounded again, sending residents scrambling toward shelters in a kingdom that has now weathered this ritual more times than most of its citizens can count. And along Iran's western flank, Saudi Arabia and the Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen traded fresh strikes, appearing to shatter whatever informal truce had been holding between them, a reminder that this conflict was never contained to a single front. It has always been a web, Iran and its network of allied militias on one side, an increasingly frayed but still functioning coalition of Gulf states and Western powers on the other, with the strait itself sitting at the center like the knot holding the whole tangled structure together. The economic reaction was immediate and brutal in its clarity. Global oil prices surged more than 9% in a single trading session as word of the tanker strike spread, benchmark Brent crude climbing above $81 a barrel, still well beneath the nearly $120 it had touched at the height of the earlier fighting, but rising fast enough to send a jolt through every economy that depends on affordable energy, which is to say, every economy on Earth. Kuwait's National Oil Company had already declared force majeure weeks earlier, cutting output as the fighting disrupted operations. Analysts who track the region for a living began invoking, once again, the specter of the. Still, China's posture, cautious as it is, points towards something larger simmering beneath this entire crisis, which is the question of who actually holds power over the Strait of Hormuz in a world where American primacy in the Gulf is no longer assumed the way it once was. For decades, the United States positioned itself, largely unchallenged, as the guarantor of Gulf shipping lanes, a role baked so deeply into the architecture of global trade that most people never had a reason to think about it. Now that role is being renegotiated in real time, not through treaties and summits, but through missile strikes, blockades, and competing toll proposals broadcast on social media. Iran wants control over its own coastline and the leverage that comes with it. The United States wants to reassert primacy while extracting something resembling payment for the privilege. China wants stability that protects its energy imports without entangling it directly in someone else's war. Gulf states, meanwhile, are left absorbing the actual physical cost, tankers on fire, sailors wounded, oil facilities targeted, while larger powers negotiate the terms of a new order over their heads. Inside Washington, the political fault lines around this war have never fully closed either. When the ceasefire briefly held in the spring, a handful of Republican senators broke from their own party to push a resolution calling for the withdrawal of American troops from the region entirely, a measure that ultimately failed but that revealed real unease, even among the president's allies, about how open-ended this commitment has become. The war's price tag has already run into the hundreds of billions of dollars in direct costs to American taxpayers, without counting the deeper economic toll of disrupted oil markets, grounded flights, and rattled financial systems. 13 American service members have died. Estimates of the war's total toll inside Iran, compiled by human rights monitors working under extraordinarily difficult conditions given the regime's restrictions on independent reporting, run into the thousands, a mix of confirmed military casualties, disputed civilian death tolls, and figures that Iranian officials themselves have used for their own political purposes. All of which is to say that even the basic scale of human loss in this war remains contested, filtered through propaganda on multiple sides, and likely to be argued over by historians long after the last missile is fired. All of this has played out under the glare of a uniquely fractured American media landscape, and that fracture matters, because how this war is being told shapes how it is being understood. Cable news chyrons cycle between framing the conflict as a decisive blow against a terror-sponsoring regime and framing it as an open-ended quagmire with no clear exit, and audiences increasingly self-select into whichever version confirms what they already believed walking in. Polling throughout the spring showed a country genuinely split, not simply along party lines but along generational ones, with younger Americans consistently more skeptical of continued military involvement than older cohorts who remember, or were raised on stories of, the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That skepticism found its way into Congress itself. Beyond the failed withdrawal resolution pushed by a handful of dissenting Republicans, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have repeatedly pressed the administration on the legal basis for continuing strikes without a formal declaration of war, invoking the decades-old War Powers Act in hearing after hearing, even as the executive branch has argued consistently that its authority to act stems from the inherent right of self-defense recognized under the United Nations Charter, an argument that satisfies the letter of the law for some and feels, to others, like a rationale stretched well past its intended purpose. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has faced pointed questioning in multiple Senate hearings over exactly this tension between an administration that insists hostilities have technically terminated whenever a ceasefire nominally holds, and a reality on the ground, in the water, and in the skies over Bahrain and Jordan that looks very much like a war still being actively fought. Ask 5 different experts where this goes next, and you will likely get 5 different answers, which is itself the most honest thing that can be said about this moment. Some regional analysts argue that Iran's leadership, battered, isolated, and presiding over an economy in freefall, has every incentive to eventually accept a durable settlement, even an uncomfortable one, simply because the alternative is continued devastation with no path to victory. Others argue precisely the opposite, that a wounded, cornered regime is often the most dangerous kind, more willing to gamble on escalation because de-escalation offers it nothing but the appearance of defeat at home. Energy analysts are similarly divided over whether Trump's proposed toll on shipping through the strait represents a genuine, sustainable new framework for Gulf security or a legally unworkable proposal that collapses the moment European and Asian shipping powers coordinate their objections through bodies like the International Maritime Organization. And diplomats watching Beijing's cautious statements debate whether China's economic stake in a stable Gulf will eventually pull it into a more assertive mediating role, lending its considerable leverage over Tehran toward an actual settlement, or whether Beijing will simply continue calling for calm from a safe diplomatic distance for as long as the crisis allows it to, watching smoke still rising from 2 tankers in the southern lane of the Strait of Hormuz. It leaves it at a hinge point that has appeared and briefly closed and reopened again more times than anyone tracking this conflict can count. A ceasefire that held for weeks. A memorandum signed with genuine ceremony at Versailles. A blockade lifted, then reinstated. A strait that has been open, then closed, then contested, then converted into a proposed toll road by the very power that once guaranteed it was free. Every time observers have allowed themselves to believe the worst is over, the worst has found a way to reassert itself. A fired missile, a downed drone, an intercepted supertanker, a diplomatic statement misread, as a declaration of war. The pattern at this point is its own kind of warning. What happens next in the Gulf will not be decided in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of decisions being made right now in Washington over whether that 20% toll survives contact with international law and allied patience, in Tehran over whether its leadership believes further escalation, buys leverage, or simply invites more strikes in Beijing over how far quiet diplomacy can be pushed before it has to become something more, and in the waters of the strait itself, where every tanker that passes through today is, in a very real sense, a test of whether the fragile architecture holding this piece together survives one more night. The world's oil, the world's markets, and the lives of sailors who never chose to be caught in the middle of a great power reckoning are all, right now, waiting to find out which way this breaks.